Okay, Rich Dolan, how's it looking?
I think we're ready.
You ready to go?
Oh, that's not mine.
Okay, we're gonna tell everything we know about Rich Dolan because we kind of know him well. No, he's such a political guy that he has his hand on the political pulse, and he's got a brand new book out. And Bill has actually read it. I haven't had time lately. I read his other book though, and I can tell you he's a wonderful writer. And UFOs in the National Security State. We've been waiting forever for the second volume. And finally, it's out, and apparently, it's absolutely phenomenal. Rich is just an amazing guy. Let's see, do we say Rhodes Scholar, finalist, whatever, and historian, brilliant mind, very level-headed, politically astute. He's also himself an intuitive. He doesn't tell you that, but he is. And I've known him from before Camelot, so I have to say that I actually tried to spur him on to more radicalism. and I know we have to move things along, Bill. Okay, Bill, why don't you do the official introduction? I think I've pushed around enough dirt here.
That was the unofficial one. Okay.
That's right.
The official introduction is very brief. 20 years ago, I read Timothy Good's Above Top Secret, which was known by many in those days as the Bible of ufology. That's the book which you give people who doubt the reality of the phenomenon, and then you say, okay, read that, and we'll talk again. Now there's a new book that supersedes this in every way. And as Kerry was saying, it's not just one book, it's a trilogy. And Rich has just published the second of 3 volumes, 638 pages is the second volume, which takes it from, is it 78 to 90?
73 to
73 to
91.
73 to 91. Some very interesting years in ufology. And volume 3 is from 91 to the present, and Rich has got no other role here than being an academic historian with all the combination of intellectual rigor and thinking outside the box. He's surfing on the waves of history itself here, chronicling these times which are unique in the history of the human race. I believe that Richard believes this too, and he knows probably more about this subject now than almost anybody else on the outside of the inside. And I'm not going to say any more.
Outside of the National
Richard,
Security State.
take it away and tell him everything you know. You've got 1 hour.
Oh my God. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks very much. I don't know if everybody can hear me. Can you hear me in the back? Yes? If you can't, let me know and I'll... All right, well, I think that just changed. It's a pleasure to be here. I'd like to thank Bill and Kerry for that very gracious introduction, and other people here at Camelot who've made my trip here a lot easier and more pleasant. I thank them also. I've already enjoyed meeting a number of attendees here, as I've often felt that I absolutely mean this. I learn more at the conferences, I think, than you do from me. And the reason is that there is never a lack of brilliant people who know an awful lot about this, and they typically will come up to me. Some of them will come up to me during the conference and proceed to tell me these incredible things. So it's always worthwhile for me to come here, and I also just enjoy meeting people. I do have a new book out. It's the second volume of UFOs and the National Security State. I do have some copies here. I hope I brought enough, but the book is easily available now at my website and on Amazon.com. And I will be talking a little bit about that. For my quarry today, I have titled my lecture, Exopolitics in a New Key, Creating a Fresh Roadmap. I don't know if that's a bit ostentatious or not. I wrote it on the plane on the way out here, so it's literally it's a brand new lecture. So let's begin. I've got 3 basic themes that I want to cover today. First, I do want to talk a little bit about my book, not to market it, but really because it's relevant toward the later themes that I want to discuss today. I have thoughts I've developed some thoughts over the last several years about exopolitics. I've never written explicitly about exopolitics, but for various reasons I am often asked to comment on exopolitics. I have, for example, spoken at every one of Stephen Bassett's X-conferences. In fact, I think I'm the only person who's spoken at all of them, and I've attended and spoken at all of the National Press Club events that he's had. So that's something of an exopolitical event, and that's put me within that whole discussion. So I have some thoughts about exopolitics, which I think are my own, and I'd like to share those with you today. And I'd like to wrap it up with continuing along those lines with my own thoughts on where we are headed as a society, as a civilization, indeed as a species. I think it all works together rather well. So we're a little bit behind schedule. I want to move right ahead. My new book is subtitled The Cover-Up Exposed. It took me about 5 years to write this book. Actually, it's impossible for me to know because my first volume that went through 2 editions, and that second edition came out in 2002. And people back then, I was brand new in the field at the time, and people said, "Oh, that's a pretty good book. What about the rest of the story?" And I thought, yeah, I have to do that, don't I? So, but then I wrote a lot of articles, and I did various public speaking venues and so forth. And I estimate about 5 solid years of working on this particular volume. It took a lot out of me in a lot of ways, to be perfectly candid with you. It was a hard book to do. Harder than the first volume I wrote. I was lucky because after that first book came out, a lot of people came out of the woodwork and offered me their resources. I had one very, very dear friend of mine, an elderly gentleman who when he passed away, left me his entire immense library of nearly a shy side of 1,000 books, not to count numerous uncounted journals, an enormous, enormous library collection, which I actually read. I went through all the journals. And you have to understand, when I read these things, I'm very methodical, if you know me. So when I read a book, I don't just read it and say, "Oh, that's a good book." I have my notes and usually my word processor, and I take notes all the way through. And every little datum that I think is interesting goes in the notes with the citation, page 77 of this issue of this journal, whatever. And it goes in so that I put them all together into an enormous database. My UFO database is equal to, I think, about a 4,000 page book. And it's from that actually I put all my narrative together. So it comes from literally hundreds and hundreds of different sources, dealing with ufology, but also dealing with politics and geopolitics and parapolitics and whatever else you want to call it. And all other sundry weird things that strike my fancy, and it all goes into my database. So then when I come to the year, say, 1977, I look at everything from that year, and it all comes together in a way that I would not probably have otherwise thought to do. That's how I write my books. That's not what they teach you in graduate school, but that is what I do. So this is a pretty big, fat book. It's a little over 600 pages. I've got lots and lots of endnotes and index entries. In fact, the other way to look at this is a series of a little over 200 specific article-length sections that I've tried to weave together. Each subsection of this book, I think, can be just taken independently and read as its own unit. So if you had a particular interest in one little thing, you could open the book and read that. But they all do work together. If you are interested in more information about this, you can go to my website, which is keyholepublishing.com. Just like looking through a keyhole, an image I've always enjoyed regarding this topic. What I tried to do in writing all books and all articles that I've done, all public appearances that I've ever done, is to try to provide a reliable guide to our past, our recent past in particular. It's long been my feeling that our past is somewhat unknown to us. And if we're going to proceed as a responsible society, we have to know our past. Much of our past exists in the form of official government documents and archives. You may not know this, but in fact, it is now widely understood that the vast majority of U.S. government documents ever created remain completely inaccessible to you and to me. They are classified. In other words, a large, not a little, but a large majority of our own history is off limits to us. This isn't just UFOs, this is everything. We're in a very, very difficult and dangerous state when the large majority of our written documentary history is not available for us to study. There's a very serious problem with that. So what I've tried to do with the UFO topic is my part in salvaging our history. I mean, literally, that's how I look at it. I don't know how complete it is, but it's as complete as I'm able to make it. Toward that end, I've used the largest amount that I'm able to of government documents, that is, proven documents that you can't make an argument against. Journals, reliable journals, or at least in my opinion, good journals, and that includes journals by UFO investigative organizations doing on-the-spot investigations, a wide range of such journals. Various books, of course, and I've done a lot of interviews for this particular book. I actually don't know how many individuals I've interviewed, but maybe a couple of dozen, maybe 20 or 30 people directly involved in the events that are in this book. I either met with in person or did extended telephone interviews or conducted correspondence with and got their story directly. And all of it, again, trying to weave together as reliable an account as I can. I want to emphasize that everything in this book, with a couple of very specific exceptions, is verifiable data. Now, there are some exceptions. Any researcher, as I'm sure you will understand, who's been in this field long enough is going to have individuals that come up to them and say, I appreciate your work. I have this bit of information that I would like to share with you. Here it is, but you have to promise that you cannot give up my identity. I have a sensitive position, et cetera, et cetera. And that happens. That's life. It's unfortunate that it has to be that way, but there it is. Now, anytime a researcher gets that information and then repeats it, keeping the anonymity of the source, of course, it's a difficult situation because it puts you, the recipient of that information, in an unequal position. And this is something that I never, ever believe in doing. My attitude as a writer and as a communicator is that we speak as equals, so that anything that I know, you should be able to know as well. That's how it should be. That's how good history, that's how good science is done. So I try to go easy with that. I'm sometimes distressed by some researchers in this field. And I'm not really going to name names. I'm not interested in doing that today. But there are people who really do this to excess, in my opinion. Maybe they feel they have no choice. They feel like they have to get the word out. But the problem is that when you do this, you're not necessarily helping the public discourse on this. What you're doing instead is creating a lot of uncertainty about it. And so we're in a difficult position. We have what we feel are certain truths and realities that we want to communicate to the rest of the world, which we feel is in the dark and asleep. I think that's true. But we have to be aware of who we are speaking to when we engage in this kind of conversation. We have to be as responsible about this as we need to, as we're able to be, and not unduly place the public's trust in what we have to say, but rather, as I've been saying, the public should be able anytime to check and verify the things that we say. Okay, enough said on that. This book really is, as I see it, three major themes that I tried to weave together. The first theme is what we might call the encounters, something of an encyclopedic account of this particular 18-year period of UFO history. So if you had an interest in the Travis Walton event, you could read about it in my book, and my hope would be that you would read the best, most concise, most complete, great account of it in roughly, I think, about 10 pages I spent on Travis Walton, that you would find anywhere. Or on the Hudson Valley wave of UFO sightings of the 1980s, ditto. Or the Hess-Dolan case in Norway. or the Bob Lazar phenomenon in the late 1980s, or anything else that happened in that period of time. My goal was so that you could use this book as a reference and a reliable guide and know what you needed to know, learn what you needed to learn. So that was the first, and that's a lot of the book. The second major theme, though, I guess would be the politics. Obviously, there's politics in this. And so what I tried to do, again, is learn and analyze the primary military and intelligence community documents that describe this, not just those of the United States, incidentally, but trying to gain the attitude of responsible agencies from any and all nations that encountered this. The Soviet Union figures heavily in this book, as does to some extent even China, the European nations most definitely, and other countries as well. Australia, Africa, Middle East are all in here. And to the extent possible, I try to weave their take on this and their attitude in here. Attitudes of various presidents, of all the presidents. Presidential policies that's relevant to the UFO phenomenon. That man in the center, of course, is David Rockefeller. He's in the book. I'll get into that in a little more in just a few minutes. The third major theme or strand of this book would be the research. In a sense, this book is a history of ufology, which is a fascinating story. In fact, of all of the things that I researched in doing this book, there were times when I felt that this, to me, was personally the most interesting. Back in the old days, when I was in my late teens and early 20s, I was studying history and English literature. That was my dual major. My focus in history back then was what is called intellectual history. It's kind of like the history of ideas. I've always, I've always been interested in that. And really, it occurred to me in writing this volume that the story of ufology is a part of intellectual history, without a doubt. And this is a story that I feel, in reviewing the literature, really hadn't been done in a synthesized, coherent way. And I think this book is actually a first true history of ufology. I'll come to that again in a moment. There's a backdrop involved in this book, and it's one of global transformation. You have, for example, geopolitical transformation, the breaking up of the Soviet Union by 1991 at the end of this volume. You have the birth of personal computing and even the internet before the end of this particular period. And we have throughout, I tried to look at what we might call advanced, either open or covert, cutting-edge technologies. And that image on the top there is the famous ARV, Alien Reproduction Vehicle. I think I saw Gordon Novell here in the audience. Gordon, hello, if you're there. So that, in other words, there are things in the larger world at large that affected this story, and again, tried to pay as close attention to them as I could. So I just wanted to expand a little bit on each of those three themes and then move on to the next part of this talk. The encounters. Well, there's just the thing that strikes me when I reviewed the cases involved, the UFO encounters that took place, is the quantity of well-documented, just astonishing, mind-blowing encounters that took place. Military cases galore, hundreds and hundreds of them. I was fortunate in getting access to a database provided to me by the researcher and former Aerojet employee Ron Regehr. Ron worked on, he was involved in building what was called the DSP satellite, that's Defense Support Program satellites. A very interesting kind of satellite in which Ron argued, I think with a lot of persuasion, that they are designed perfectly to be UFO spotting devices. In any case, Ron was able, accidentally but legally, to obtain a list of DSP tracks of fast walkers during this period of time. In other words, fast walker being the code word for UFO in the upper atmosphere or in space. There were, I'm trying to recall, from 1973 to 91, about 283 I think that's right. Fast walker trackings by the DSP satellites during that period of time. It's like one every month or more, 15 a year, I believe. A couple of them were really interesting, one in which an object came in from space and did a U-turn in the vicinity of one of the satellites. There was also a DSP tracking of a UFO during the spectacular 1976 Iranian jet fighter intercept. Many people are familiar with this, and I, again, cover this at length in my book. Make a long story short, in September 1976, over the city of Tehran, and of course this is back in the days of the Shah when Iran was an ally of the United States, a large number of Tehran citizens saw this very unusual object in the evening sky. They called the local airport. The air traffic controller person at first thought it was silly. Then he went out and looked and saw exactly what people were reporting, and he called the Iranian Air Force. They sent 2 F-4 fighter jet interceptors in succession. And we know all about this because we know a lot about it because we have a very extended Defense Intelligence Agency memo describing this in fascinating detail. And what happened is that in each case of the F-4 encounters, when they got to within a range of 25 nautical miles of this object, which they tracked on airborne radar, which they saw visually, which astonished the pilots, each of them, when they got to within 25 nautical miles, their key electronic systems went offline. In one case, right before one pilot was about to fire a missile at this object, it disabled the missile system. It so happens that we have DSP tracking data of a fast walker in exactly that spot at that time. Pretty interesting confirmation indeed. Back to the quantity of these encounters, and what we find is just an enormous amount of unexplained events going on that any responsible researcher would have to inquire about. Forget the issue initially of aliens. The biggest frustration I have when I talk to skeptics about this is that they jump 10 steps ahead of the argument. And they'll say something like, well, that's impossible because it's impossible for aliens to come here from another planet. Don't you know anything about astrophysics, or space travel, or the impossible? Well, okay, I can't argue that, and I know as well as the next person that we don't have a way ourselves of getting to the nearest star, not officially. But nevertheless, the real issue is in looking at these UFO reports and then trying to make sense out of them. Sure, it's easy to just say it's impossible, but the question is, what do you do with the reports? Well, what most people do is they ignore them, of course. That's the easy thing. A number of other very interesting developments during these years. Abductions, I actually write quite a bit about that phenomenon. And again, I'm going to come back to that shortly. The mutilation phenomenon, is that or is that not related to the UFO phenomenon? I think it is. Crop circles, ditto. I think that there's a relationship there. And all of these I tried to deal with as well as I could. So, concluding provisionally regarding the encounter thread of this book, there's a lot of conclusions we can make. Let's keep it simple. There is an overwhelming evidence for UFO reality. To me, if I were to have the opportunity to speak to somebody on NBC or some major network, this is the message I think that I would emphasize. That let's take one step at a time here. And the evidence is overwhelming. And this was my first primary goal in putting this book together, was to lay that evidence out as persuasively as I could. The politics, I'm going to expand a little bit about this. Let me just put all these out there. We can talk about them at... Oops, okay. There's a lot of themes in my book that deal with what we would call the politics of UFOs. Each of the presidential administrations, I put my timer out here, I did deal with. 1973, we had Richard Nixon still in the White House. There's some pretty good Nixon UFO. There's one great Nixon UFO story. That's the Nixon-Jackie Gleason story, and that's in my book. Jimmy Carter, and the whole, skipping Gerald Ford. through Carter, through the Reagan and Bush years. It turns out that each of these presidents has some fascinating connections to UFO history. So that's one aspect of it. Then the military intelligence community confirmed documents inform a lot of this book as well. One thing that is very clear from looking at the mass of that data is not simply that the phenomenon is real, but that they were very, very concerned about this phenomenon. Makes perfect sense. When you're in charge of managing security over an Air Force base and an object that you can't identify as coming over your base, doing things that are not supposed to be possible. For example, in the wave of airspace violations in 1975 along the northern U.S. border into Canada, over many bases with a Strategic Air Command, triggering maximum level alerts, sirens going, lights flashing, and all of that, with objects hovering 500 feet over weapons storage facilities. Yes, it happened, and it happened multiple times during a brief period in late 1975. And we know for sure that this excited the concern of responsible agencies. We learned about this because we were at a very unique stage in American history in the late 1970s, and that was when the Freedom of Information Act was actually kind of, sort of useful. And back in those days, this was the early Carter years, Jimmy Carter had a very liberal attitude about FOIA and did promote a relative amount of openness in relation to these government documents. There's still a great deal that was never released, and in fact, of all the Freedom of Information Act documents we have, almost none of them were of the level of top secret or above. The highest good ones we have are classified secret and below. There's a couple of documents we have that were top secret, and they're all excised, and blacked out or whited out, so you really can't read what's in them. But nevertheless, a lot of good information came out, and during that period, we learned about these airspace violations in the mid-'70s. During the late 70s, early 80s, there's overwhelming evidence to show that intelligence groups infiltrated UFO research organizations. They clearly did this earlier as well. But there's my argument in this book is that circa 1979, 1980, there was an active effort by agencies, once again, to infiltrate the field and to stir up the mud and make it essentially a lot more difficult for us to know what direction is up and what is down. But there's more than this. One of the things that I brought into this volume that I really did not do a lot of in my first book, because I don't think I was there mentally myself 10 years ago, is what I would now call the larger geopolitical realities. Forget UFOs for a moment. I think that most people can now recognize that the United States president is probably not the guy in charge of the country. Okay. So we all know this. So then the question becomes, well, who or what is? And that's a harder question sometimes to answer. Certainly this is not a question that I see getting raised in the standard halls of academia. I don't see this raised in political science departments or history departments around the country or beyond. I think that they're still stuck in a much more conventional mindset. But the fact is, what I try to do is analyze each of the presidencies and their relationship to the elite organizations, the infamous Bilderberg Group, CFR, Trilateral, and so forth. Is there a relationship? Well, the answer is absolutely 100% yes. Absolutely yes. Not maybe, but yes. And this is important. The kingmaker of the United States for the past half century easily has been David Rockefeller. You don't get to be president until he says, you are going to be president. Gerald Ford was a 5-time Bilderberg attendee back in the 1960s. He didn't just come out of nowhere to become the first unelected president in American history. Jimmy Carter, as probably most people in this room know, was lifted almost directly by David Rockefeller and Zbigniew Brzezinski and dropped into the White House. That's really the case. I mean, Jimmy Carter interviewed with them. before he got the Democratic nomination. They were impressed by him. They said, yes, you're going to be our man. And Brzezinski, of course, became his national security advisor. And he's now, of course, one of the key advisors and point men for Barack Obama. Some things never change. Carter's the influence of the Trilateral Commission in the Carter administration was actually much commented on at the time. And 1980 presidential candidate Ronald Reagan made a lot of political capital out of this fact. Ronald Reagan in 1980 sounded a lot like Ron Paul did last year, believe it or not. He really did. Ronald Reagan campaigned in 1980 against the elites, campaigned against the Council on Foreign Relations, campaigned against George Herbert Walker Bush in that regard, and said, in fact, that man will never be part of my administration. Well, it so happened that Ronald Reagan's campaign manager was one William Casey, key leading CFR man and a close friend of the Rockefellers. And all of that changed, obviously, when Ronald Reagan selected Bush as his running mate, causing a number of longtime Reagan supporters to walk off the stage at the Republican nomination, in fact. A month or two after that, in September of 1980, Ronald Reagan had a pre-victory campaign meeting, a campaign party, September of 80, and seated to his right was David Rockefeller himself. So that's how it all works. I have some points even that I make on the assassination attempt of Ronald Reagan by John Hinckley Jr., son of John Hinckley Sr., who was a very close friend of George Herbert Walker Bush, very close friend. Hinckley's older brother, Scott Hinckley, that night, the night of the assassination attempt, was due to have lunch with Neil Bush, son of the vice president. Very interesting indeed. A confluence that major media really did not delve into at all. Okay, moving ahead then to other themes. Well, before I leave this, I'll just then say that the United States presidency, as I argue, the U.S. president, let me put it this way, is essentially a sales rep. And his job is to sell you really two things these days. The first thing that he's got to sell you is globalization, which is a bitter pill for many Americans to swallow. So he's got to be good at that. And then the other pill he's got to make you swallow is whatever new war comes down the pike. And they do this on behalf of international financial groups. One of the other things that I will mention before moving on is I did a brief, but I think concise analysis of the Gulf War. It's not a UFO event, per se. But it's important. It's important in order for all of us to remind ourselves that we need to take the veil away and see our power structure for what it is. And the reason is that if we are interested in what we call disclosure and openness from our government, then we need to know exactly what that government is. We can't go through our lives rerunning our fifth grade civics class version of the government in our mind. You know that version. You vote for your member of Congress. This is all on Schoolhouse Rock, if you live through that. Your member of Congress, and then how a bill becomes a law, and the checks and balances, let's not forget that, and on and on and on. That's really not our world anymore. We're in a different world. And we need to understand the true structure of power as it exists. So it's an important part of what I try to do in this book. The other aspect, we'll loosely call it under politics, would be the technological considerations. Again, asking a question, which I don't have a complete answer to this, the ours versus theirs issue. So if you see a UFO, who made it? Did we make it? Did, quote, they, end quote, make it? It's a hard issue always to resolve, at least in my own view. I try to look at this by understanding what was the state of our official technological achievements at certain periods in the history of this. What were the possible states of achievement in the black world, in the covert world? And trying to piece this together. Black budget matters and privatization of the secret also figure into my book. What is the black budget? Well, I think you all know. It's not just classified federal spending, though. I think there's a lot more that goes into what we call the black budget. I think there's a great deal of what we would all call illegal money going into black budget, into what we would call special access programs or waived special access programs or unacknowledged special access programs. There's actually a whole host of other program names that have come across me in my research. They have little to no, let's say no oversight by Congress. They have little to no oversight sometimes by their own agencies, whether it's the Navy or Army or Air Force or any of the intelligence groups. Who knows who runs some of these things? It appears that there's a lot of illegal money flowing through, whether that's narco-trafficking dollars or securities fraud, stock market fraud, flowing through our government like the blood in your veins. And by privatization of the secret, what I mean is, again, forgetting UFOs for a moment, I think it's not hard for all of us to see how government agencies, and this is not simply the US, have become completely dominated by private money. I think we can see this. And so it's also the case with the UFO secret. One of the points that I make, and some of this, not all of it, does come from a couple of sources that unfortunately I'm just not at liberty to say who these people are, but I've been given information that I think is valid, that indicates a massive runaway nature of the UFO secret in the hands of private, semi-public, but often very private interest groups. Certainly when you look at the special access program, that whole world, the few studies that have been done on it do indicate that private contractors are the dominant partner rather than DOD personnel, who function, for their part, primarily as gatekeepers for money to flow in. But the actual decisions are run by, whether it's Boeing or Lockheed or SAIC or Raytheon or whoever is running the program. They're the dominant ones. And it makes sense. Because think about it, if you're a Pentagon 4-star general, when you retire, who's going to hire you? Well, those companies will, at a nice cushy job, making a lot of money. And it's all this revolving door that goes on. So the private industry, and it's also very much easier for keeping the secret when you privatize this. Because the information then doesn't become classified, it becomes proprietary, which is a much, much better way to keep this information from the public. And it becomes profitable, of course. If you assume, as I do, as I've come to believe, that much of this involves retrieval of acquired technologies, exotic technology, not manufactured by human hands. So then you've got this little artifact that you've got to study, and you may not be able to duplicate it right away, but you might, after 10 years, come up with some pretty nifty ideas on what you can do, and you've got a great money maker there. And so really the incentive for giving this secret up becomes less and less and less over the years. So it naturally becomes private. Of course it does. So the obvious conclusion, this is the kindergarten level conclusion of the politics portion, is that there's an active international cover-up of the core of the UFO phenomenon. There's obviously much more that I try to say regarding that. But again, if there's a single takeaway message, that would have to be it. It's a real phenomenon, and yes, Virginia, there is a cover-up. The research, I'll get a little bit more into this. As I say, it's a history of ufology. A fascinating bit of history. And it's in a sense, you might say, a part of the history of the development of human consciousness. And think of it this way. If we've had this phenomenon that's observed us for who knows how long, right? And it's really during, I believe, during the 1970s and then the 1980s when researchers, in a sophisticated way, tried to understand who these other beings were. It's our attempt, in a sense, to turn the tables and understand who they were. Sure, there were researchers in the 50s and 60s. I don't really think that they were, pardon me, I had a very late lunch, so I'm still feeling. I don't think that researchers in the 50s and 60s were quite there and asking the kinds of questions that came up in the 70s. Something of an intellectual revolution in UFO research took place during these years. A lot of new issues came up that hadn't existed before. The whole concept of crash retrievals became big. There was a lot of resistance to it. It's a story, again, that I document. The story of those people who tried to bring this issue to the fore and those who said, no, that's a lot of nonsense. It was a very heated issue. Still is to a lesser extent. In the 70s and 80s, it was a big issue. People got very upset over it. The topic of abductions, probably more so. Yes, it had been known that there were probably isolated cases of what appeared to be abductions by aliens. Everyone knew about the Barney and Betty Hill case of 1961, and a few others. But the idea back then is, well, don't be in the wrong place at the wrong time, because if they see you, they may just take you. What happened during the 1980s was a completely different understanding of that phenomenon. People like Bud Hopkins, foremost among them, argued, no, that's not how it is at all. This phenomenon appears to be very widespread, based on my investigations, and seems even to run in families. People are repeatedly experiencing this phenomenon. In other words, a kind of way of looking at it that, again, met a tremendous amount of resistance at the time. The mutilation controversy really reared itself in a significant way during this period. Again, there had been some cases of mutes in the 60s. They didn't get a lot of attention until the mid-70s, and they've continued. Mutilation cases are disturbing, fascinating. Crop circles, not so disturbing, but equally fascinating, came up as a major topic during this period of time. The other thing to say about the research is the effect of the Internet on research. We all know how the Internet has changed the world. It certainly has. It also changed ufology. What it really did is, starting around 1987, it just caused ufology to explode. That's basically what happened. You know, prior to 1987, if you were an interested researcher in that topic, your venues for expressing your ideas were very limited, basically. There were some journals that were out there with a limited distribution. You could try to create your own journal, which some people did, and have an even more limited distribution. All the journals had their own editorial policies for submission, of course, so you had to be careful what you wrote. And that was about it. Starting in 1987, 86 and 87, we get the very beginnings of what we now would call the Internet. Back then, there was no World Wide Web, but there were news groups, bulletin boards. And in fact, the earliest non-computer programming bulletin board was dedicated to UFOs. UFO Topic is one of the true pioneers of the Internet. And by 1987, it allowed people in this field to publish their thoughts without having to worry who was going to edit them. It just went out there, and suddenly they were getting more readers than those people who'd submitted their articles to the MUFON UFO Journal. And suddenly, the old guard of ufology lost control over this domain. You could say that's a good thing, you could say that's a bad thing, but that's what happened. For better and for worse, in fact. Because after that, a flood of information then came out. And again, a fascinating story. So, that's the story of the research. And the conclusions of the book, let's just say, roughly speaking, the phenomenon is undeniable. The cover-up is undeniable. There's a confrontational nature to this phenomenon. There are many of them. Militaries around the world have been chasing these things. Not just the American military. Now, that doesn't mean that we're the bad guys or that we're the good guys. That's a different issue. What it does mean, though, is that there is some trouble in paradise. Someone's not getting along with someone else. That we can say. Abductions, in my assessment of this, there is no question there is an abduction phenomenon. And it is not, as has been argued by some people, most notably Dr. Stephen Greer, simply a military phenomenon. In fact, I think it's irresponsible to make this argument. There is something... Yes, you can clap for that. It boggles my mind to be perfectly candid here, that a researcher can make such a blanket statement. You have a phenomenon that's gone on globally for a long time. You have individuals that are describing highly consistent things in terms of their abduction experience. And I don't know what else it can be other than a kind of religious-like zeal that can cause a person blindly to say the only abductions that occur are military. This I find indefensible. And I think that a careful review of the evidence certainly leads to that conclusion. Another conclusion that I draw in this book is the runaway nature of the black budget. And in a sense, what I've come to call a breakaway civilization. What do I mean by that? Let me explain. In the course of human history, we've had multiple civilizations coexisting at the same time. Go back 1,000 years. The civilization of China was very different from the civilization of the Near East or of Europe or of North or South America. Over the course of the last millennia, of course, these civilizations have increasingly come to merge and to interact with each other. In a sense, the story of our civilization is the coming together of these various cultures and civilizations. And yet we have this history of separate coexisting civilizations. So it's really not a new concept. Even during the Cold War, certainly the scientific infrastructures of the United States and the Soviet Union didn't share their information with each other all that much, right? The Soviets had this belief in the theories of a fellow named Trofim Lysenko, utterly absurd biological theories, but the Soviet scientists held to this as a part of state dogma through the 1960s. So my point here is that we have examples of separate scientific infrastructures. What I'm suggesting in this book is that what we call the black world, existing as it does with essentially an infinite amount of money to play with for all intents and purposes, and an incredible amount of secrecy within which to perform what they do, really no oversight. What would actually happen if, after it is inevitably the case, a couple of brilliant, genius black world scientists stumble across a new scientific reality based on the technologies that they're looking over? They come up with some really super nifty ideas. Would they share it with the rest of us? We have this idea that there's a spin-off technology involved, but is it necessarily so? And what happens, as always is the case with science, where one breakthrough leads to another one, which leads to yet another one. The next thing, before you know it, they're up here and the rest of us are down here, and that gap may, in fact, continue to increase to the point where they have the ability to do things that we would consider absolutely impossible. They would be so different that with justice we can call them a separate, or what I call breakaway civilization, with a completely different understanding of certain scientific principles and certainly a different worldview. Because very likely, as I believe, they're interacting in a much more up-close and personal way with them than we are. So they have a different set of principles through which they live their life. And you have to wonder, how would they even be able to talk to us easily about what they know? Just as if we were to be time travelers going back 1,000 years, how would we talk to people of any society of 1,000 years ago? How would we be able to tell them the things that we know? It might be difficult. I think that's something that we need to consider that's already happened. I'll do a little quick glimpse into my forthcoming book, Volume 3, which I have tentatively subtitled The Fight for Disclosure, and it will cover the year 1992 to the present. I have really, nearly all of my research for that is done. It's one reason it took this book so long, is I ended up doing research for Volumes 2 and 3 all at once. So I think it'll be a lot less time for me to do this book. This is just off the top of my head on the plane flying here, my thoughts on how this book is going to come together. The Internet revolution, obviously, I don't think needs to be gainsaid here. What also happened in the 90s is an explosion of reported UFO sightings. It's incredible. Go to the National UFO Reporting Center on the web, run by Peter Davenport, and you'll find he catalogs about 5 1,000 UFO sightings each year. Now, most of these don't get investigated, clearly. They're what you'd call raw reports, but they're pretty interesting. I myself investigated 2 cases out of that database, and I came away feeling that both of those were legitimate. I'm not saying all of these cases are legitimate, but I think a lot of them probably are. And the fact is that in our own age, it's easier and easier now to report this. There's no official government body that you can report this to, which is a failure of our republic. Very much so, because frankly, if you encounter what is the most amazing thing you've ever seen in your life, one would think there should be an agency in your government that is charged with dealing with it. That's why the government is supposed to be responsive to you, right? And yet there isn't any. But yet there are places on the web. And it's easier and easier to report it, so we get there's an enormous amount there. There have been the release not just of some legitimate documents, really the glory age of freedom of information, I think, was in the late 70s, but what we've had since then are continued releases of official documents, but also the release of a lot of disputed documents. These are the so-called majestic documents. You can read all of them at the website of Ryan and Bob Wood. I think that a very good case can be made for the authenticity of many of those documents, but the point is that they're disputed, and what that means is they're of unknown provenance. And again, it served to muddy the waters of this field. I think it's important that we continue to try to do research on those documents to try to authenticate them or not. There have been a lot of initiatives in the 90s and in our own century toward disclosure. I'll deal with the Rockefeller Initiative, the whole Roswell GAO, General Accounting Office fiasco of the early 90s under the Clinton years. The efforts of Dr. Stephen Greer in the 90s leading up to his press conference in 2001 is very important. The efforts of my friend, Stephen Bassett, I think figure into this equation. The sci-fi / John Podesta event of a couple of years ago, all of these are important. In other words, what I think we're seeing is very much an increase in the attempts now for citizen groups publicly to grab this issue and make major statements about the need to end the cover-up. Much, much greater than had ever happened in the past. Much, much more so. There's also a very significant part, and this conference is obviously a very strong reflection of this, is the growth of what we might call higher consciousness attitudes within the UFO community. Back in the 80s and 70s, there was a little bit of this. If you go back further to the 1950s, certainly what we would call the contactees would be considered sort of new agey for their time, without a doubt. But really, I think this is a different order of magnitude, what we've been experiencing through the 1990s. I think it's probably connected with greater communication through avenues like the internet. Certainly, it's an important part of what's going on, and it's something that I'll need to deal with in an appropriate way in my book. The other big thing geopolitically is the death of the nation state. The New World Order, okay? This is probably the greatest unremarked upon, at least in the mainstream, event of our lifetimes, at least geopolitically. Nations, I don't even know what a nation is anymore. Do they even exist? You have groups of people living with the same language in an area. Is that a nation? Who is sovereign? Are you sovereign? Are we sovereign in our country? Well, we are in theory, and we must continue to fight for this. In reality, our world has become something very different. And this has got to be part of any study of the UFO reality in the last 20 years, because, again, we have to understand the true nature of the structure of power. Thanks. I'm told I have 15 minutes left, so I'm going to, I have no idea I'm going to get this all done. Because that was only the first of my 3 sections, so what can I tell you? Oh, well. A new exopolitics. Well, maybe that's an overly dramatic statement. Look, anytime we're going to talk about exopolitics, that is a relationship of us and them, well, those are the two variables, us and them. And we have to have a clear understanding of both of these variables to be able to talk intelligently about what we will call exopolitics. It's got to be done. So, through all of this as well, it is essential, absolutely essential, that we ask ourselves, how do we know what we know? What is our source of data? And who are we saying this to? What I mean here is that if we're going to be talking about other entities in the galactic civilization, we better damn well back up what we say with something other than, I got this through a remote viewed bit of information or through direct contact with an alien being. I'm very sorry, that's not enough. It may be enough in a private conversation with other researchers if that's what you believe. Everyone's entitled to have their beliefs. I speculate all the time. But we do ourselves a disservice as a community when we go fast and loose with this kind of thing. We've got to be more disciplined with how we speak to the world. How would it be if when you get an opportunity to say what we're believing to a larger media organization, we just go off with this and look ridiculous? We're not in a position where we really can afford to do that. We have to be more careful. We can speculate, but we must distinguish between what we know and what we believe. They're not the same. It's not hard to do. It just means qualifying one's statements a little bit, okay? I don't think that's asking too much. Let's look at us a little bit. Let's understand who we are. What we've had is a situation where we've been retrieving exotic technologies. Now, there's a big statement by me, I grant. It is something that I believe I back up sufficiently in my book. There's been a great deal of information on this. Everyone knows about the Roswell case, and there are many others, frankly. These technologies, this is my hypothesis here, okay, have to be kept secret. You got a Cold War going on back in those days. You can't let the Russians see what we got. Requiring secret budgetary appropriations, i.e. the creation of a black budget. The UFO phenomenon is almost certainly a key factor in the creation of the black budget world that we have today. Not the only one, but one of the key motivators, I think. Privatization, I'm just going to have to run through this. Runaway technological achievements. This is our secret infrastructure. That's part of us. Okay. Now, I put this is messy. You could tell I did this on a plane. When most of us, I'm excluding the present company here, but I think most people go through their lives with the assumption that we get our sources of information from, like, the media, and that would include TV, but also internet. We have a political system, we have an academic community in which there's a back and forth kind of exchange there, so that they also are responsive to us, in theory. The media, of course, we're told, well, they give the public what the public wants. And the academic world, of course, is supposed to be responsive to the inherent value of truth. And there's a back and forth there. The political system is supposed to be responsive to us, throw the bums out, and so forth. How is it really? Well, this is how I think things have actually shaped up. You've got the arrows going one way here. It's going at you. And it's not just media and the politics and the academics. There's a corporate system in place. This is something that exopolitical analysis doesn't fully get. It's great to talk about personal transformation, but we live in a world of corporations. And they don't give a crap about personal transformation. They're driven by profit and shareholder value. That's all they care about. They can be driven by beautiful people who really do care about the world, but if they're not increasing shareholder value, they're gone. Corporations have an iron law in which they must increase shareholder value. That is their raison d'etre. If they're not doing that, then the CEO is gone. Which means that they must behave in certain ways. And those certain ways, unfortunately, are not typically designed to increase higher consciousness among the people. They are instead designed to take money out of your bank account. That's what they do. That's our world. And there's a great deal of interaction between those major worlds. And there's other branches I probably could have thought of if I had more time. under a rubric, though, of an elite. Yes, there is an elite. I don't know what to call them anymore. I used to call them the national security state. Well, they're not quite national. They're a little bit more than that, aren't they? International, financial, national security state. You toss in entertainment state. If you looked at America as a room of 100 people, okay, and if this, and there's $100 in the room, assuming the dollar's still worth something when we do this, so one of those guys would own 40 to 45 of those dollars. That's America. That's the world, really. And then another guy would have another 11 bucks, and then the last 80 people would have really nothing. So that's a room that has a political system. It's got a media. It's got all of these things that make it go. It's not hard, really, to figure out who's going to be in best position to manipulate all of these things for his own benefit, obviously. It's the guy with the 40, 45 bucks. That's our world. It's not complicated. And yet, of course, it's never analyzed in this way in our mainstream media, and precisely because they're owned by that guy with the 45 bucks. So we have to disabuse ourselves of the notion that we have a truly open process. In any way. We don't. It's not. And this matters when we talk about UFO disclosure. Because doesn't it matter, if you get disclosure from your government, what the nature of that government is? If it's a Republican system that is responsive to you, that's one thing. But what if it's a proto-crypto, postmodern fascist state instead? Well, guess what? It is. We're not moving toward democracy. And by the way, as I said earlier today, I don't think democracy is bad. What I think is uninformed citizens of a democracy is a very, very dangerous thing. Are we moving toward a world of slaves and slave owners? Yes, we are. That's the direction. Escape into your own little private Idaho where you can play your video games and watch TV and zone out. And it's a lot more fun, frankly, than dealing with all the stuff we have to deal with. If your house is on fire, but you're having a really wicked, cool dream, who wants to wake up and deal with the crisis? What is our world moving toward? We've decoded the human genome. We're making amazing strides right now in the world of nanotechnology. What will be called quantum computing, artificial intelligence, creation of a super race, maybe? Getting rid of redundant people like us. There's that word. You hear that a lot these days, redundant. Isn't that scary? Scares me. People are not redundant. So we're in a postmodern dystopia. We're depleting our resources. We all know this. Threatened cascading failure of the global ecosystem. Failing global infrastructures. Is there an end game scenario being discussed by those people in the know? Are they planning something? Other people have discussed this earlier. I'm going to let you just ponder that one yourself. Now let's look at them. Who are they? How can we learn about them? This should always be at the forefront of our thinking. Well, you can learn a little bit about them through reviewing some of the UFO sighting literature. There are many cases of people who have described, seemingly honest, very, very low-key people who said, yes, I had an encounter with a being that I don't think they were human. And there's a lot of that, and we can learn a lot from that. Abduction literature, yes, also, but let's be careful. And the only reason I say that is because when people are taken, or seem to be taken, it's not under the best of circumstances, and there certainly seems to be a lot of manipulation going on in there. Experiencers, remote viewers, yes, but we have to be very careful. Let us not be irresponsible. I'll leave it at that because I'm running short. Who are they? Here's a few factors about them. They operate by stealth, at least usually. They don't seem to be that interested in letting us deal with them in an open, public way. I think, personally, that there's more than one group involved with diverse agendas, probably. According to abduction and other kinds of research, they're highly telepathic. They have an ability to manipulate human thinking, human emotions, as do, in fact, a lot of military covert technology. They appear to have some mastery over space-time. They don't seem to have kinds of emotional responses that we do, at least not most of the time. Do they look like us? I think some just, well, maybe they do. It would be logical. If I were an alien here on Earth, I wanted to deal with the native species. I would probably enhance or manipulate my own native humans and have them do work for me. Where are they from? Are they from another planet? Are they from another time? Are they from another dimension? I don't know. I don't know. Don't know. Are they truthful or not? Ah, okay. Again, let's pretend that we're time travelers. You go back 1,000 years. You talk to the most intelligent person in the world 1,000 years ago. Let's say, I don't know, some monk in an abbey who happens to be a genius. So you sit down with this person for a day, and you try to describe our world. How many mental revolutions is that person going to be able to handle before they just say, I can't take it? Okay? Probably a lot, right? Not too many, I mean. Tell them that the Earth goes around the sun, or that these little things called viruses, or, you know, all kinds of technological capabilities. There's only a certain amount that a person can handle. If they are coming here to deal with us, I think it's reasonable to assume that they're not telling us everything either. Did they create us? Did they manipulate us? Did they enhance us? If so, do they see us as their investment? Do they see us as their property? How long has this been going on? There's fallacies involved here. And I'll probably end it here. I'll just skip my last third. It's not that necessary. Here's a fallacy. If they're so technologically advanced, they must have solved their major social, economic, and political problems. You hear this a lot. I hear it a lot. I don't buy it at all. Again, we go back in time. Let's say all of us go back with our iPods and our cell phones and maybe a couple of laptops, and we meet, doesn't matter where we go, we meet some people of 1,000 years ago, and they look at this laptop and they're like, whoa, man, that's cool. For you to have gotten to this level, you must have solved all of your social, economic, and political problems. And then, right, we would look at each other. We say, well, okay, you take care. Oh, and keep that on safety, you know, whatever. Okay, they may not have either. In fact, when you really think about it, if you look at the species that we know of on Earth, it's only the highest intellectual species, us, that has the ability to be sadistic, that tortures. Maybe the higher up the ladder you go, the greater the range, from the angelic to the truly demonic. And again, maybe that's the case with them. I don't, all right? Are they ready to welcome us with open arms to the cosmos? This was a statement, I admit, this was what Dr. Stephen Greer actually literally said at Barcelona a couple of months ago. And I watched it on YouTube thinking, what? I'm sorry, I beg to differ. I beg to differ. If I am allowed to run a little bit over, I don't want Bob to get upset. I love Bob and revere him. In fact, Bob, if you don't mind, if you're there, I'm going to try to wrap this up as soon as I can. There's a disclosure paradox here. It's impossible. It can never happen, but it's inevitable. Let's talk about some of the fallout of disclosure. These are some, and certainly not all, of the issues that a true disclosure is going to have to deal with. Why have we been chasing them? Why is there this confrontation going on? How have you been able to keep the secret, Mr. President? What does that say about the structure of our secrecy? Oh, that's going to be a lot of fun to talk about. What are all these secret programs about? Is there a secret space program? That might be a tough one for the President or any other responsible agency to discuss. Yeah, we actually are going off-world, people, and we've been going to the Mars and Moon for X number of years. You know, a lot of people might be a little upset about that, having paid for a program that they may not have known about and might have wanted some control over. And then dealing with who these other beings are may not be an easy issue. Understanding why they're interested in us. There will be challenges, I guarantee you, to the structures of power in this world, politically, finance, industry, all of these. I will not have time to go through these. This was an expansion of what I was just telling you. I will pause here. Their interest in us. Why are they interested in us? Well, it's not that hard for me to see this one. This is an easy one. 100 years ago, we had horses pulling carts. That was our world. 100 years ago. And we're now at the verge of having your computer be as intelligent as you are. And this is the latest from AI experts, 10 years, as they say. Your computer will have the full computational power of one human brain. That's a major milestone. And of course, once they achieve that, they're going to surpass that. So your computer's going to, you'll wake up and you'll chat with your computer. Your computer will sound like a person, except, well, be a little bit smarter than us. You know, do a quadrillion number of calculations per second, or pull any data off the internet like that. So a really good personal assistant. Let's hope they don't pull a Terminator or a Matrix or an iRobot on us. The point that I'm making is we're about to reinvent our whole civilization. Other intelligent species that are looking at this must be able to know this. They must be able to know that we are about to leap into their world. We've actually been in their world all along. We've only been asleep. Now it is time for us to wake up. Many, 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 many disclosure problems. Where do you want to start? How do you undo a lie this big without angering so many people, without threatening your own status? Think back just a little more than 2 decades ago to Gorbachev and his glasnost, which 6 years later ended the Soviet Union. Spiral of reform became too much. It just got out of his control. You start talking about openness, and suddenly the Baltic states say, great, we don't want to be in your country anymore. Remember how you took us over in 1940? Oh, yeah, that, right. We're gone? Okay. So what would happen after 60-plus years of a UFO secret? Would there be a spiraling out of control? It might start off real, manageable. It might not end that way. Would there be vigilantes? Let's get the aliens. You're an alien. What if we got free energy? Everyone talks about free energy, like it's going to be the greatest thing. What if it isn't? We used to have free energy. It was called oil. Oil, for all intents and purposes, was free for a long time. And we did things with oil that really weren't all that heartwarming to the earth. Now, it's true that with free energy, we might not have to hack down the whole global ecosystem. You might be able to heat your home forever, for free, I guess. You might be able to make a really neat bomb, too, and blow up the Pacific Ocean with that same source of energy. If it's not tightly controlled, I don't know. There's a lot of possibilities here. The fire of Prometheus can be good and bad. And again, I'm not arguing that we shouldn't move ahead. We have no choice. History is bigger than we are. Read Tolstoy. He'll prove it to you. History is bigger. Things are going to happen. And we're going to get it. It's going to happen, but it may not be fun. It may not be easy. And in the short term, all right, if we discover through the secret set, well, there's a better version of petroleum. We don't need that. Hey, that's great. Steel, awesome. We got this nanotech, whatever. Electronics. Well, okay, in the long run, this is fabulous. In the short run, it will mean major financial disruption. How long will that last? 10 years? More? It won't be fun. Or it may not be fun. Certainly not for those elites who may own those industries, but it may not be fun for us either. It's going to be a bumpy ride. And nevertheless, it will happen. They can't stop this. You can't stop history. The pace of change is so rapid, it's so revolutionary. It will not be stopped. Bill Joy, the co-founder of Sun Microsystems, was very concerned, is concerned over the runaway nature of artificial intelligence and is afraid of a kind of Terminator-like scenario or some other equally bad thing that may happen. And a number of years ago, for years, has been calling to other executives to try to slow down or even stop the development of advanced AI. It's impossible. It's spitting into the wind. You can't win. There's always going to be forces that will, let's tweak this program here, we'll fix this software here, and it's going to happen. And it's the same with disclosure. We're in a very unstable period of our history. It's like everything's bouncing around. That is exactly, in my view, the type of environment in which some monumental mistake will occur, in which the secret will come out in some way. I don't know how. I don't know what the trigger will be. It's going to happen. When, I don't know either. I predict within 10 years. Now, when it happens, there's going to be attempts, you know this, to control the spin. Okay? It's going to happen. And so it's going to be our job, the job of any responsible researcher, and your job, to ensure that that does not happen. We've got to make sure that the actual truth comes out, even if it's horrible. Even if it's horrible, especially if it's horrible. There's no other way we're going to be able to deal with the reality until we learn the full import of what is going on. And at the bottom here, I say not one enemy, but maybe two, maybe several. By that I mean, the enemy isn't just the national security state, which has been hiding this information from us for all these years. They are a problem to deal with. But there may be some extraterrestrial or interdimensional or non-human intelligences that may not be working toward our best interest. If we don't acknowledge that at least as a distinct possibility, I think we're fools. We have to, even if their intentions may not be bad. What happens to indigenous cultures when they encounter a highly technically proficient society? We know. And maybe in the long run things get better for them. I don't know. You can decide that for yourself. But the point is that we have to be vigilant against a variety of fronts here. Hope and fear. Fear is an enemy. We know this. Because when we are afraid, we react irrationally to things. We don't think through. Hope is an enemy too, though. That sounds kind of wrong, doesn't it? Everyone likes to have hope. Don't give up hope. But here's the problem with hope. Hope also deludes. We need to have a cold eye. We have to be able to look at reality in as alert and awake a fashion as we can. This is why I love the title of this conference, Awake and Aware. That is exactly right. What is true higher consciousness? Well, it starts with awareness, with seeing things as they are. Not as you want them to be, not as you hope they can be. You have to see them as they are. And it is only through going over that first large hurdle, I feel, that we can really attain a true higher consciousness, a true awareness in which we are awake, not asleep. Carrie often writes in her emails, awaken the dreamer. I think that is exactly the attitude that we all must have. We've been in a dream state and we have to wake up. That's everything. Thank you very much. If you have any other questions, you can go to my website. Thank you. I also, thank you. Thank you very, very much. That's so much. I just want to say that I have, unfortunately, a limited number of books here. I will be at my table in the back right outside there, and if you are interested in a new book, I have it. I'll be glad to sign it for you. If I run out, they're easily available on my website or through Amazon.com. Thanks very much.
Richard, thank you. Thank you so much.